Start with the risk management framework. So risk assessment flows throughout the risk management framework. There's no specific risk management framework step that specifies doing a risk assessment, but it does a lot of times, especially if you're looking in the supplemental guidance or in the instructions, it'll reference using results from a risk assessment. So that's why we want to, it's kind of separate, but you know, the risk assessment is certainly a vital part of all the risk management framework steps. And if we recall from the overview, we talked about how we use risk assessment in each of the risk management framework steps. So we'll be revisiting that as we go through. But so we've done the risk assessment. But there's still even a few more things we have to do before we actually jump into categorization. And one is just getting some things down on paper or down electronically about the system in the system security plan. So I provided you a template, which we're going to look at in a minute, and we're going to complete the system identification section through section 1.7, and we're going to refer to that practice system that I gave you, the big system with all the different components. When we do this part, we'll see in a minute. Now, for your own systems, of course, it's very important that you get some good boundary determinations. In Special Pub 818, there is instructions and guidance on how to do system boundaries and what is appropriate. So, you know, the short list is who has management and budget control over the system. Is it all in the same environment of operation and serving the same function? So these are some things you can look at to help you determine your system boundaries, so that one reason for that is who is responsible. So we don't want to have overlapping components, part of more than one system. We want every component on our network and in our organization to be accounted for and part of one single system. So we have a one-to-one relationship there. One component in one system, and we don't have the same component in two systems or two systems with multiple components. No, we have a one-to-one relationship between components and systems. Does that make sense to everyone? Because otherwise then we don't know who's responsible and we have things slipping through the cracks. We have rogue components out there that aren't configuration managed and no one's taking responsibility for those components. So it's important to do our component inventory and to make sure of what system these components are part of. So
that's unrealistic, isn't it? Because most systems are built on multiple components.
Right. I mean, yeah, there would be multiple components within a system, yes, but those components should only be part of that one system, and not. And there should. And we've seen a lot of confusion where it's a server and it's or a group of servers and it's supporting applications, and then the people who have the applications they say that server's part of their system, and then the people running the data center, or they say they're claiming it as part of their system, so who's really responsible? So you have to make those determinations. But yes, of course, systems are going to be comprised of multiple components.
But you want
it's
to
just
have one valid owner for the component.
Right. And again, that's for responsibility and accountability, so that we know who's responsible for that given set of components. It's not more than one person, and so then we don't run into the finger pointing game or any of that stuff. And so there's our fake system that we've already seen. And so we've already done the risk assessment. But anyway, let's go. We'll come back to this slide in a minute, or after we do. So open up the document that is called RMF Workshop SSP Moderate Template. So this template is a template that I developed based on the guidance in 818 when I worked on the operational side at NIST. They're still using it today. Now, it's not the one that we have posted that I had access to is not updated for revision 4, and that's okay because they're not behind, because per Office of Management and Budget guidance, they have till April of 2014 to get that template updated. So, but as a result of the fact that it's not updated now and I don't have time to do their work for them anymore, because now I have other work to do, so I wasn't able to take the time to update the template in its entirety for you for Rev 4. But I did, in here I provided the controls. I just have an abbreviated set of controls. I don't have the entire moderate baseline in here. So if you choose to take this template and use it and modify it, then you'll want to make sure that you go back to 853 Rev 4 and address all the controls in the moderate baseline or whatever baseline you're trying to address. So just a word of caution there. But anyway, you are free to use this template all you want. You can change it, modify it, throw it in the trash, whatever. But for the purpose of this class, it was expedient to just go ahead and use this template. So the first part of the template is system identification. And so we just want to get some things noted down, who's responsible, what the system title is, the categorization. We just want to address, again, this is a moderate impact template, so the system categorization is moderate. We're going to still go through the categorization exercise next, but just for purposes of the course, this is the moderate template, so our system categorization I already filled in as being moderate here. Your results may vary. We like to give it a unique identifier that's useful just to make sure names aren't similar, so you have that unique identifying number. You can make it whatever you want. And also it's useful if you want to put it into a database so you've got a nice unique key to use. Who's the responsible organization? Who's the authorizing official? I left it in here, and don't let this confuse you. You don't have to have a co-authorizing official. We use one at NIST, and you might find in your organizations you have these same problems. We had lab directors that were physicists and chemists and all of those sorts of things, and they aren't security practitioners, and maybe a lot of them unfortunately feel that security is annoying and gets in the way of them doing their science. And so we were finding at first when we just had the lab directors being the authorizing officials that we were getting a lot of accepted risk, kind of like Patrick mentioned about the mobile devices, and they were just accepting risks that really weren't acceptable. And so we had to put a check and balance in there, and so the NIST co-authorizing official is the NIST CIO for all systems. So the NIST CIO co-authorizes all the systems to operate at NIST. And then if there's problems, the CIO has to go back to the lab director and they have to hash out what's going to happen to mitigate deficiencies. So that's what we did. You don't have to do that. I just left it in there as an example so you could see what options you might have. Of course, you identify who the senior information security officer is, who's your information system owner, and this gets back to the boundaries. The boundaries are with respect to the information system owner, who owns it. And usually, again, that is the person with direct budgetary and management responsibility for that system. And again, in 818, there's a lot of detail about these sorts of things and how you sort out those boundaries and the responsibilities. And then you also designate who is the system security officer, and that person is, the system owner is responsible for everything about the system, the functions, everything. The security officer is focused on the day-to-day security responsibilities of the system. So usually it's the information system security officer who's actually completing the system security plan. The system owner is responsible for making sure it gets completed, but usually the system owner is not the actual person that's doing it. If he or she is, that's fine too, but normally that's not the case. But the system security officer would do the brunt of the work, obviously in coordination with the system owner. And then as time went on, the system security officer would be responsible for maintaining the security plan and other security issues, like perhaps reviewing logs and for security issues and whatever needs to be done from a security perspective. And so you designate that person, and of course make sure you tell that person that that's their responsibility. And then we have our system operational status. So we just say if it's just operational, if we're still in the initiation phase, if we're doing a major modification, we had a system that's been in operation, but now we're going to make some big major changes to it, and that's maybe going to take a year, so it might be under major modification for that amount of time. And since we are constantly keeping our security plan updated, then when it's all done, the major modification's finished, we go back and change it back to operational status. Even if it's operational during the time of the major modification, we still, anyway. Spend too much time on that. Then we go ahead and write out a brief, high-level description of the function or purpose. And by the way, throughout the template, I've included instructions in red. So if you're a system security officer and you're trying to fill out this security plan, there's instructions provided to you about what you should do. So, and that came about from because I spent a lot of time reviewing system security plans, hundreds of them, and a lot of it stems from my frustration of having to correct the same problems over and over. So I try to be specific in my instructions to the greatest extent possible. So again, those are there. You don't have to use them. You can change them. But just for the sake of this course, they're in there. So what is the function and purpose of the system? What user population are we serving? Are we serving the public? Is the purpose of the system to have public users come in and get information? Or are we serving our internal people? So it's nice to know that up front when you're completing your system security plan, and it's also really useful for assessors when we get to step 4. What are the roles of the users? Do you have a lot of administrators? How many of them do you have? It's really useful also to know that, how many users do we have and how many people have privileged functions. So if we find that, in that example I gave earlier, everyone has privileged capabilities, then that's probably not the way to go. Or even if you have 25 people with privilege, that's a lot. You probably want to keep your privileged users down to a minimum. Well, you always want to keep your privileged users down to a minimum based on least privilege anyway, but it's important to know how many people we have with those capabilities. The system environment, here's where we either include our diagram in here or we can reference that our diagram is elsewhere. So I might have mentioned in the overview, it's not a good idea to have any kind of documentation in more than one place. You want an authoritative place for your documentation and keep it there. So if you put your diagram here, then keep it here, and this is where you're always going to go and change it. If you have it in some other document or some other area, whatever, then reference it here and always make your changes to only one single document. So I just went ahead and put that in here. Then you would do your hardware and software component inventory. We don't need to see the list of 500 components listed here. We would probably definitely want to reference where we can find that inventory. And that's for both hardware and software. So we include that information here so that everybody can find that information when they need it, and also when the assessors come in so they can see not only that you have it done, but where is it. Who owns it? Is it state-owned, or do you have contractors? Are you using a contractor system perhaps, or whatever? Where are the system components located? So you can see quite a lot of instruction there, but basically, is the system living in a California-owned facility, a contractor facility, or somewhere else? Like user homes, if it's laptops. If the state has issued you a laptop and you keep it at home, and the system includes that laptop, then you would know we have 27 laptops living at people's houses, right? So pretty straightforward there. And who is supporting the system? Do we have contractors in place? Do we have developers that are contracted, or do we have internal support for the system within the state? And then we come to the interconnections. So interconnections are, we have NIST Special Pub 847 that tells us about interconnections, system interconnections. And what we mean by system interconnections is our system is going to be interconnected with another system. That doesn't mean a user's opening an SSL or VPN connection that is a temporary session. So it's persistent connections, either from something like a T1 line or some sort of a dedicated always-on VPN connection, something along those lines. So the difference is persistent versus non-persistent sessions. So we only document our interconnections and have an interconnection security agreement with those persistent type of connections. So that's what if we have that, that's what we would document in section 1.6. Maybe we don't have that. And then we also designate who the connection is to. Is it to another government agency? Is it to a business, or is it to citizens? And so that's the G2G, G2B, and so on. And is it a trusted connection? So then finally in section 1.7, that's where we would designate our applicable laws that affect the system. I just wrote in their state of information, the state of California information security policy. I don't know what that is. What was that thing you said, Patrick? 5100?
5100.
So that might be something you would put here, things along those lines. If you are a state hospital, you probably have to deal with HIPAA. So you would just note what regulations you're under and that the system is subject to with respect to security. And so that's the first part. And so we're not actually going to take the time to fill all of that out now because in the interest of time. But does anyone have any questions about any of these things in the identification section? Any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
When you're talking about, like virtualized systems and ownership and things like that, I mean, how are you dividing these things up?
Yeah, virtualized systems can be a real nasty problem. So it's hard to keep, I mean, some of them can be only stood up for a short period of time, and so you don't even, they just stand up a virtual system to test something and then get rid of it right away. So the answer is, you've got your, it's still somewhere behind the virtual system is still some hardware and software. And so you want to at least account for that, who's running, who owns the hypervisor, who's managing how you get space on the virtual machine, right? Somewhere back behind the virtual machines you have that information. So certainly if your system includes that, then you would at least include that in your system. Now, whether or not you want to include the actual virtual machines that get, created based on who has access to them, that depends. I know at NIST we don't include those. So we've got the server people. They run that, and they have their process on how you get space on the virtual server. And then but once your virtual machine is stood up, you are responsible for configuring that securely and patching it. And especially if it's going to be a persistent virtual machine, then you definitely want to keep an eye on that. So hopefully the hypervisor can at least give you the information of who's running, how many virtual machines are running, right? And so that's the way you have to coordinate that, and you have to make those determinations who's going to own what. And so, like I said, our server folks keep track of who has the authority to create virtual machines, and then we know that those people are responsible for the configuration management of those virtual machines. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Anybody else have questions on system identification, asset inventory, interconnections, responsibilities? No? Okay, so then we are going to move on to categorization. And we said in here, I already put moderate, but we're going to look at the different information types. So if we go and open a spreadsheet called Risk Management Framework Info Types Checklist. So let's open up that spreadsheet and we'll see if we can come up with what information types we're storing, processing, and transmitting on our FIPS system. So before we start categorizing, I'll just quickly double back to the risk assessment, and I say here that there's debate about whether to conduct the initial risk assessment before or after categorization, but I feel pretty strongly about you should at least take a stab at it before you start categorizing, because again, you might find some things out during that that'll affect how you do your categorization, and then again in the circular feedback loop, we might have to double back after we do our categorization and update our risk assessment. So again, we've got some circular activity there, one informing the other and vice versa. So we're going to use the information types checklist that we just saw. This checklist, I did not make this up, nor did NIST. It is found in, these information types are found in this special publication, 860 volume 1, but those came from the Federal Enterprise Architecture. So similar to how we said, if you'll recall from the overview, that the privacy families were derived from the Federal Enterprise Architecture, these information types stem from the Federal Enterprise Architecture. So we, and it was another sort of mandate that came down from above, NIST, you will create an information types, or a categorization guidance, but it will be based on these information types. So we didn't have much leeway there. But anyway, these are the information types that we have to live with in the federal government, the ones that are in that checklist. But there is instructions in 860 volume 1 that allow you to create additional information types and add them in. So especially at the state level, you might find that the information types that you have are not found within that list. And so then you can go ahead and create your own and give them provisional impact ratings and add them to your overall information type catalog. So with our fake system, when we just had all these various servers and desktops and laptops and wireless and routers, and so we're going to have a lot of information types flowing around in there because we have all those different types of components. But probably in a more focused system, then we might only have a couple, 3 or 1 or 5 information types. We want to use the high watermark concept. So unlike the matrices we use where we said, low and high equals moderate, no, that's not the case here. We use the high watermark. So if we have information types that are low for availability and moderate for integrity, but high for confidentiality, then that information type is going to be high. So we take the high watermark. If we have another information type that's low for confidentiality, but moderate for integrity and low for availability, we still take the moderate, because that was the highest impact rating of that particular information type. Then we take all of those high watermarks and see what is going to be the categorization of our system. So if we had 6 information types and the highest information, the highest impact level of any of those was high, then our whole system would have to be high. But we want to make sure we retain that information, because if we found availability was low on all of the information types, then there's some things we can do later when we go to our select step and our tailoring, and we can use that information to help us tailor down and make sure that we're not putting high impact availability controls in when even though our overall system might be high, our availability was low. So we can still make some adjustments there. So we still take the high watermark, but we still consider the specifics. So we're kind of being a little duplicitous there, but anyway, we'll see that when we get into the tailoring. Let's see, what else do we have here? Right, so we document all that. If we, and unfortunately we don't have 860 here to look at, and we also I don't have it noted down what the provisional impact rating is that 860 gives us for all the information types. But if the provisional impact rating is moderate for confidentiality, and you decide, because based on your risk assessment or whatever other factors, that it's okay for it to be low, then you want to document that. Why did you make that decision? to make it low, even though the recommended impact level was moderate. And then let's see. And then the rest of the step one, even after we've done our categorization, is to make sure you register that system. There's a process that Patrick has. Somebody has. I thought you said they have to tell you about it.
Well, there's a couple of things. There's the annual capital plan, and then there's the project initiation process. But there's no real registration process within the state.
When you do the project initialization, is there a security aspect there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, especially in the new process, the new stage 1 business analysis. So what used to be the concept statement, we're in the season right now. I understand we have 87 such requests across the state landscape. Our office will see each and every one of those and make some early and perhaps even guesstimating some security impacts at that time.
Okay, so for now, the process within the state is just to do that project initialization process. So at least on some level, somebody somewhere knows that you're standing up a new system and you're not just throwing a bunch of machines onto the network without anyone knowing about it. And then finally, again, like I said already, you might need to revisit your risk assessment and make some adjustments. So let's go to that spreadsheet, the risk management workshop information types. And there we see the list. If you point, and by the way, again, the names here, which NIST did not make up, are not always indicative of what the information type really is. So point at the little red triangle and you get a little description of what the information type actually is. So don't let the title fool you, because it's not always, in my mind, it's not always obvious from the name. But anyway, just go ahead again. Don't get bogged down in really detailed, trying to really figure out as if this was a real system, but just pick a couple of information types that would be reasonable to think that they would be processed, stored, and transmitted on our fake system. So just go ahead and take a look at it, and then give them a rating of confidentiality, impact, low, moderate, or high, and same with integrity and availability. So just pick two. And I say pick two. Again, don't spend a lot of time, but also try to make it reasonable. So let's just take only 5 minutes to do that. Does anyone have any follow-up questions about determining the impact levels of our information types? I mean, part of the problem is just determining what our information types are. What are the information types that are being processed, stored, and transmitted on the system? And if we don't know that, then we can't make impact determinations, and then we can't choose our correct baseline, and it gets uglier from there. So it's important that if you as a system security officer don't know, you have to start interviewing people, and whoever does know, the system developers, the program managers, whoever it is that knows the types of information and what's really going to be happening on the system, so that you can find out. And it's important to try to consider all the types of information. One of the types on there is I think it's under information technology, and there's one of those information types. Any system that includes hardware and operating systems is going to have that. Maybe not applications, maybe not, but it includes like account management information, and so anytime you have any kind of identification and authentication or logging in going on, and you're probably always going to want to select that information type above and beyond whatever the functional information types are. So watch out for stuff like that too. Don't forget your system information. So no questions? Okay. All right, so then, so what did we come out with? So again, as we move forward, we're going to be still thinking of moderate, but just out of curiosity, did anyone come up with high impact?
We had one high impact, and that was in criminal investigation.
Criminal investigation. Okay, maybe. I'd be interested to compare it with what the actual provisional impact ratings
In
were.
real life, it doesn't turn out that way. but
I know.
My enforcement guys like to know.
I'm sure they do, I'm sure they do. Yeah, and watch out for people who have an overinflated sense of importance about their system and their information. And I'm not trying to be mean, but I've seen it. You know, and you're gonna run the gamut. Then you're gonna have people going, no, mine's low, mine's unimportant. They wanna be, you're gonna have people that wanna be under the radar, and you're gonna have people that think their thing is the most important, critical thing. So it's hard to find people with actual realistic perceptions of their own systems and or you know, information. So anyway, let's go ahead and close that one out.
The checklist is what it shows.
And let's see, let's go back to the instructions. So now that we have our system categorization, which is based on the categorizations of all the different information types we determined and what the high water mark of that was. So in your case, although we're going to only deal with moderate, but if that was real, you would be dealing with a high impact system now because that was your high water mark. And if anybody came out with low, all lows, you know, then, so to be a low impact system, every single thing has to be low. Low, 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 everything low. So normally most systems are going to, unless it's like a publicly available system or something like that, most of the time you're going to be moderate. The vast majority of systems come into as moderate. So with that, we know that we're going to start with the moderate impact baseline from 853 revision 4. And that gives us a starting point set of controls that we should think about implementing on our systems. And then the other, there's a lot, it's not quite that easy though, is it? So, because we have a lot of decisions to make, and one has to do with control allocation. So we have that set of 269 controls and control enhancements in the moderate baseline, but it might be that we don't need to implement every one of those controls on every single component, and probably we don't. So we have to start thinking about, you know, when we had routers and we had firewalls and we had servers and we had desktops. So various controls are only going to be applicable for various ones of those platforms. So we have to start thinking about that and keep an eye on that, because that is another way that you can also save resources. So you don't want to be spinning your wheels implementing controls on laptops, you know, that are really only meant for, really only relevant for servers or useful on servers or firewalls or something like that. So just keep that in mind. The baseline assumptions, we talked about that in the overview session. If your system is living outside of those assumptions we made, then you might have some supplementing to do. You might have to supplement the baseline during the select step, because we made assumptions in the baseline that don't apply to you. Or if you remember, we noted some specific assumptions we did not make. And if those assumptions we did not make apply to you, then you also probably have some supplementing to look at as you select your controls. Let's see, recall, okay. We already talked about the overall system impact level. And of course, in the select step, we start with our common controls. So right now today, maybe your organizations don't already have a nice list of common controls. So we've been doing this at NIST for a long time. So we have identified, the organizational level has identified a set of common controls that our systems can inherit. And so if you had a more mature process, or if you already do, then you would take a look at the very first thing you do during the select step is identify common controls that you can inherit, and then you can toss that aside and you don't have to worry about those anymore. Other than to keep track and make sure there's no POAMs against them, or that if you decide you can inherit a control and that common control is applicable to you, you just note that down in the system security plan, and then you move on to the controls that you do have to implement at the system level. And you know, even if your organization doesn't have a list, you can still come to some conclusions yourself about common controls, especially like policies. When you get to account management policies, maybe your organization has some policies already, about account management that direct you on how to do account management. So you don't have to spend your time at the system level writing out a policy for that because you already have it. Okay, so we talked about the tailoring process. We're not going to have time in this workshop to actually go through and do this, other than we are going to do some parameter selecting. And actually, I suppose we might have time to do a scoping, but probably not. But if you were doing this in real life, you would certainly do your parameters. You would certainly do some scoping using the scoping considerations or your own risk-based determinations. And what did we already do today that would feed into this? What did we just do all morning? Risk assessment, thank you. So the risk assessment would be a really important document to use to help you determine if you should scope out of something, if that would be appropriate, and also it might help you with your parameters. If you found some weaknesses in certain things, like user training perhaps, then maybe the parameter where you select how often you do user training, you can make that higher, because now you know from your risk assessment that you had a problem. So maybe instead of doing annual training, you do a big annual training with some sort of every 6-month reminder training or something like that, I don't know. But that's the idea behind that. You select compensating controls if you need to because you scoped out of something. And then you also select supplemental controls if you need to. So that's the process first in the select step. And then of course, whatever you do, whatever decisions you make, you document all of that in the security plan. And don't forget, we're not going to do this today, but during the select step, we develop our continuous monitoring strategy. And that's because we're probably going to need some controls around that. So while we're selecting controls is the time when we also determine what our continuous monitoring strategy is. Because when we get over to step 5 and 6, and the system gets authorized to operate, and now we're going to go and flip the switch and start operating that system, we better already be monitoring it. The step 6 starts right then. So we better already have that stuff in place. And that's why we start thinking about that early in the process here in the select step. And then the final task in the select step again is to get your authorizing official or officials to review and accept that security plan. So before we start digging in and implementing controls, we want to make sure that the authorizing official thinks that those controls that we selected through our tailoring process is appropriate for the system, to protect the system that's commensurate with risk. Okay, so now let's go back to the security plan. And so normally you would start with a security plan template, a moderate security plan template in this case, that already had all the moderate, oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention back to categorization, in section 1.8 of this security plan template, that's where you would document all your security information types that you determined and what their impact level was and what the overall impact level is. So don't forget to document that in the security plan in section 1.8. But anyway, moving on, in section 2 is all of our controls. So again, if we have a template and we're doing the moderate baseline, we have a moderate baseline template, and it would include all the controls and control enhancements that are in that baseline. And as I mentioned before, I didn't have time to update this template. It kind of takes long anyway. But the controls that I did put in here, I did update. So this is a partial list. This is not the entire moderate baseline by any wild stretch. But pretend like we're starting with a moderate template that has all the moderate controls from the 853 Rev 3 moderate baseline. And by the way, in your set of documents, I included the moderate and high baselines there, so you can see the controls and the control enhancements that are actually in the revision for low and moderate baselines. So you can refer to that if you want to today. But in any case, I've included in here one control from every family. I didn't know how much time we were going to have. It turns out not that much. So we're not going to be able to look at every control that, let alone every control that's in the moderate baseline, but not even every control that I put into this quasi-moderate baseline template. So let's go ahead and you can see that wherever there was a parameter selection to make, I highlighted that in blue to call that to your attention so that you know this is where you have some decisions and you can make some adjustments. Again, like I was saying as an example, if you found that you were really weak on security awareness and training, then if we go down to AT family, oh, here's something else first, sorry. Well, okay, let me finish one thought at a time. Oh, there it is. Oh, what? I didn't include, okay, I lied. What is wrong with me? I would have sworn I put an AT control. Well, I know that one of the AT controls is awareness and training, and in that there's a frequency selection parameter, and so you could select, every 6 months instead of annually, or or quarterly or whatever, to help you increase that awareness. So sorry about that. But anyway, let's go back up here and get back to that idea of our big giant system. It's got all of these different types of components in it. So again, like I mentioned earlier about allocation, we're not going to be allocating the same controls to every component. And not only are we not going to allocate, we are not going to be implementing them in the same way. So there's going to be different ways of implementing different controls on the different components and types of components. So what I like to do to remind people not to forget certain components and remind them to address all the components that they have so that things aren't slipping through the cracks and we don't end up with incidences. I just put a list in here of all the different types of components that we have to address. So if we're doing least privilege, and we go through here and we do all of this, but this might be different, The organization requires users of the system accounts or roles with access to security functions to use non-privileged accounts. So if we're talking about a router, we don't really have users using routers. We really have people with privileged accounts always using routers. So that might be one where it's different between routers and desktops, because we want people on desktops to be not having admin privileges. And we want, but when we go to look at routers, users aren't using routers. Who's ever going in to do anything to a router probably should already have privileged access. So that's just an example of how implementations might be different. So what you have to do is address that, and again, you can see how this can get pretty complicated, especially in a system with numerous types of components and platforms, and you have to address any differences in your implementation and in your allocation for all of those things. So just calling that to your attention. And that's why in some of the controls, I listed out all the different types of components. And when I used to do this for a living, that's what I would make everyone do. If I got a security plan back and I could look at their diagram and I could see they totally forgot about these Unix servers. So, so then I would list out, address these Unix servers. How is your implementation different on these Unix servers versus these other types of machines? So, so that's that. So let's just take now, what time is it? Let's just take two controls and have you try to pretend like you're going to be figuring out how to implement them on your fake system. Is this account management? Okay, let's do access enforcement. Because your access enforcement is going to be different on possibly different on all, and if it's not different, then you can just say same as above or same as, you know, whatever. You can say you could group the routers, switches, and firewalls all together. Maybe they're managed all in the access enforcement is the same for all of them versus the servers. So work on how you might think about doing implementation for access enforcement. And let's pick one from down here somewheres. We'll give you, how about media sensitization? That's pretty easy. And then there's some assignment statements there for you to make some determinations about. So let's do AC3 and MP6. So get in your groups and again, don't get super bogged down with actual details, but just think about some ways that you might implement those controls for all the different types of components that we have. And then you can see how difficult it can get and why this is really a time-consuming process that you cannot do in 2 hours. Find the types of media that you want to apply that to, and also what your procedures are. All right. Okay. So yeah, let's move on. So now you can see the kinds of discussions you get in, the kinds of issues, people, you can see that you might have to go and have a lot of discussions with system administrators and things along those lines. So as you move through the whole set of controls, you know, you'll see a lot of that, and you'll need a lot of coordinating with the other people within the system, especially your system administrators, database administrators, your network administrators, and all of those people. Especially if it's an existing system. And then you might find that what they have in place already is insufficient. And so when you go back and do your control assessment, which we're going to look at right now, whatever they had in place already, maybe not so good. And then that'll lead to some sort of a finding and perhaps mitigation. But anyway, let's go back to the instructions. And so we're not obviously going to be able to implement any controls. We can't fake that here. But of course, if you, in real life, you would. And also, when you go through this process, you might also, so first of all, you base your implementation on what the functional description in your security plan is. And you make references to other documents. And you should be implementing based on what you wrote, in what you're defining your requirements for the security of the system in the security plan. So that's how it should get implemented, especially if you're starting from a new system. But you might also find that you need to double back and make some changes to the security plan when you start getting into the implementation phase. Maybe what you thought you could do, you can't do, or things change a little bit. So you want to keep that. Again, we always have that circular feedback loop going. You might have to go back as you start actually implementing and make some changes to what you wrote in your security plan. Okay, so now we have we've categorized, we've done our select step, we've done our tailoring, and we've actually gone in and implemented the controls as we've documented in the security plan. And so now we're ready to see how did that work out. Are those controls operating as intended and providing the security to the system that we need? And so that's the purpose of an assessment. And a control assessment is not exactly a risk assessment, but there's a lot of risk assessment elements in the control assessment. And they're certainly tightly coupled. And like I mentioned earlier, when you do your security assessment, when you come out with findings, you know, those might need to be put into your risk assessment. But we also have a template that you can sort of combine the two together, so you don't have to have a bunch of different documents. But in any case, some things you need to consider before you start the assess step is what level of assessor independence is required. Now, at the federal level, and this is one of the controls in CA2, CA2 Enhancement 1 applies to moderate and high impact systems. And that tells us that we have to have assessor independence. So if you have a low impact system, you can have your own system staff go through and do the assessment. But if you have a moderate or high impact system, then you need someone independent to come in there because your impact is greater. So you really want that more assurance, you know, because if you're a part of the system, it's not even that you want to not be 100% accurate, but you think you have it down, and you know, so you might not always be the most appropriate person so to make sure when we have higher impact systems, we use those independent assessors. Now, at NIST, we have a whole group. It used to be for years, it was one other person and myself trying to not only help people develop their security plans, but also actually going out and doing all the assessments on about 75 systems. And so that quickly became impossible. We could never ever keep up. We always had a queue of 27 systems or more that needed to be assessed and were past due on assessment, and the two of us absolutely could not do it. And so we were able to leverage that because there was a federal requirement to do so. We were able to leverage that into hiring up like 10 more people on our team, and that's the situation they have today in that department. And even with that, they can still barely keep up with the assessing. But in any case, so that provides that level of independence for all of those moderate and high impact systems that you may have. Or the other option, unfortunately, is to hire contractors. So you'll find, depending on the size of the system, that contractors are going to probably charge you between $50,000 and $100,000 per system. So you can quickly see why, if you have to keep on assessing systems on a regular basis, it's a lot cheaper to just hire your own internal staff to do it. And then one thing that came up yesterday in conversation, which was kind of an interesting thought, is you could also work on trading off. So you could have one system security officer from one department do an assessment on another department and vice versa, so that you still have that level of independence, but you're making a trade. And maybe that's a way to get it done, in the absence of any other options. And then we talked yesterday also about the Air National Guard people, the California Air National Guard. They are not doing a full-on control assessment, but they are doing, they're providing for free of charge, a vulnerability assessment on your system. So they'll come in and do that for you for free because they're Air National Guard, so they're not active duty. They want to practice their skills, and so it's a win-win situation. It helps you find some vulnerabilities on your system. So if you want their information, I believe you're supposed to email Patrick, and he will...
or email the office security
if you know, yeah.
at state.ca.gov.
There you go. And then Patrick mentioned also that they're not, the Guard people are not sharing their results. They're not providing results to Patrick's office. It's confidential, and it's just to help you find out what your vulnerabilities are before the baddies do. So, and even even if Patrick's office starts going out and doing audits or reviews of your system, don't take it personally, and take it as if they're helping you. Again, they're helping you find what your problems are before somebody else does, because Patrick's group isn't interested in seeing you exposed on the front page. In fact, quite the opposite. So don't have a negative attitude about that, because it really is trying to help you fix your problems before somebody else does. But in any case, you need to figure out what you're going to do if you have an assessor independence requirement, and then what is your assessment depth and coverage. So again, if you have a low impact system, you're not going to need to do as many types of tests or types of assessment methods. You might not need to look at as many components because you have a low impact system. And then as your impact grows, your depth and coverage needs to increase. So you have to consider that. What level of assurance do you need? And like I said, part of the assurance is an independent assessor versus a non-independent assessor. If you get an independent assessor, then that's going to give you more assurance but that's just one example. And again, 853A has a lot more information about all of these things. And then just like when you just did your security plan and you did the access enforcement control with all the different types of components, you had to perhaps account for them in different ways, how you're implementing the controls. Likewise, the assessor is going to have to use that information and test things differently depending on how it was implemented and what it is. So that's another one of the many reasons why it's important to have that document in your security plan, because your assessor is going to come in and they're going to want to assess against what you've written in the plan. And so that means they have to also account for all of these differences. And then they're going to leverage related controls. And I didn't mention this during the select step part, but you'll leverage related controls as well. But it's almost more important for the assessors. So if they're going to go in and look at your Active Directory settings, that's going to cover a whole lot. That's going to cover AC2, AC3, IA2, IA3, IA4, IA5. All of those controls are being covered, and they're all noted as related controls in 853. So it's important for the assessors to know they only want to go in and look at Active Directory one time. They don't want to go in alphabetical order, do AC2, then go do a bunch of other stuff, and then come back and have to look at Active Directory again. So they should be leveraging those related controls. All right. Let's see. Okay, sampling. So this also relates a little bit back to the depth and coverage issue, but let's just talk about sampling in general. When you're doing an assessment, and say you have 100 desktops, and they're all Windows 2007 desktops, and in theory, they should all be configured exactly the same, we hope. That's what we want as part of our configuration management. And so, if you're an assessor and you come in and you don't want to have to look at every single 100 desktops, that would take so much longer. So you can start deciding, is it feasible? If you have 100 desktops, I would say sampling is absolutely feasible, or more, of course. But then you have to decide what's a reasonable sample size. So what I like to do is start out with, say, using 100, since that's easy, start with 10%. If you have a smaller number, you might want to up that. But in any case, if you have 100, start with 10%. Say you're going to pick 10 desktops at random to look at their configuration and see if it's in compliance with CM2 and CM6 controls in the CM family. And maybe some other controls too. But anyway, and then you start looking at them. You look at the first machine, it's pretty good. You look at the second machine, it's pretty good. You're not finding problems, you're not finding discrepancies. And you go on and say 9 out of 10 of those machines are pretty good. You didn't have any discrepancies. So that's pretty good if you only found one machine out of 10. And yet 10%, then that means 10% of those machines are out of whack. So maybe you want to go ahead and just check a couple of more. And so the idea is, until you feel comfortable as an assessor giving it a satisfied or other than satisfied rating. So if you find that 10 out of 10 are 100% in compliance, then I would say move on. Don't spend any more time on that, because then you can get a pretty good feel that they've got their configuration management under control, and you don't have to spend any more time looking at the configuration on those desktops. So that's just an example. And again, if you have a high impact system, your sample size is probably going to need to be bigger, because you're going to need more depth and coverage there. And if you have a low impact system or even a moderate impact system, you can start cranking it down a little bit on the depth and coverage for your sample size. And then, we're not going to do that now, we're not going to do it, but I just want to point out that for anything that's a common control, for your program management controls and for your privacy controls, those still need to be assessed and authorized. So don't forget about them, not just focusing on the system level controls. And so now we're going to look at another template that we developed at NIST for the internal NIST assessments. And it's a security assessment plan template. And in the security assessment plan template, that's where your assessors would outline what they're going to do. Do we remember the 3 types of assessments that we can do? Assessment methods?
Examination, tests, something.
Right. Yeah, I heard some mumbling. Interview, examine, and test. So before you even start assessing, the assessor is going to take your security plan and all your information, and they're going to decide for every single control and for every single type of platform what they're going to do. And getting back to the depth and coverage, if they have a high impact system, they're going to be doing more tests, more examinations, more interviews than if you have a lower impact system. So, or maybe if it's a high impact system, they're going to do all three, and if it's a moderate impact system, maybe they're only going to interview and examine. But they need to have that all outlined before you begin the assessment, so you don't just start diving in without knowing what you're going to do. And also, the security assessment plan should be approved by the authorizing official before the assessors even begin. So right now we're going to enter some fake results into our security assessment plan, although maybe we better not because we're really running short of time. So let's just take a quick look at what the template even looks like. What is that? Where is that thing? Okay, so the template is it's named the RMF Workshop SAP SAR template. So you can look at it up here, or you can look at it on your machines, on your desks. But you can see here that it's just a spreadsheet. And by the way, these, I had to change some things to sanitize it, you know, because there was some NIST specific information already in here that was pre-filled. And when I did that, it messed up these down arrows. What this originally did was let you select the assessment methods you were going to use and put them in there. So if you can use this. If you have anyone that's clever with spreadsheets, maybe you can work that back out again. I'm not clever and I didn't have time to figure it out. So, but anyway, that's what those arrows did originally mean. But anyway, you can see that basically you would put in here for CA, well, that's not the best example. So for AU5, response to audit processing failures, it says in your security plan that alerts are provided to the system administrator and the information system security officer. That's what your security plan said. So your assessor is going to come in, and that might require a test, right? To see an actual test. Did a message get sent to those two people? So there's an example where you might actually have to do a test. Another example that you could probably just do by examining is the content of audit records. The audit records contain the information specified in the security plan. So if you said in your security plan that the audit record must contain successful and unsuccessful logons and whatever, then I'm going to examine those audit records and I'm going to see, did it capture that information? So that's how that works. Does that make sense to everyone? Yes? Okay, good. So we would go through the whole process, and again, maybe it's different for the different types of platforms. So we might need to copy and paste our list of platforms and components in there so that we make sure as assessors that we get everything. So don't forget about that. And so then when we're all done, we give it a satisfied or other than satisfied rating. And sometimes if you're on the other end of the assessment, you get upset that you're not getting credit. For instance, if you look at a control like AC2 that has A through J or A through K or something, there's and you had everything but G done, and you're still other than satisfied. That's so unfair. Yeah. I did all this other work. But you can still note it down, and you would have to as the assessor, that this one was all okay, but overall, G was not done, so overall you have other than satisfied findings. So then, when you've done all of that, you come along and you have to capture all this information in your security assessment report. So the first one we looked at here was the security assessment plan, and as you go along, you enter all your results in there, what your findings were, and then you come here to the security assessment report and risk assessment or risk table template. And you can see how we've kind of folded risk assessment in here. You can see that we have likelihood and impact determinations here. We already know what the vulnerability is because we said it's vulnerable because this isn't happening. Those audit logs don't have the information that the security plan said they should, or they aren't being sent, they're only being sent to the system administrator, not the information system security officer like the security plan said. So you put that, that problem in here as that's your vulnerability finding. And then you also identify the threat source. So that pretty much covers our risk assessment, right? Because what were our factors? Threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts, right? So we don't have to go back and enter into another template. We can just use this as our risk assessment on controls. We annotate the control number that is associated with the defect. We do that likelihood and impact, and then we make some notes or possibly a justification. And we make a justification because the last column is accepting the risk. So if we say yes, we're going to accept the risk, then we have to make a justification for that. Now, we're the assessor, so we're not actually making these decisions, but we fill this out because we're, as assessors, presumably subject matter experts, so we are filling that out to help the system owner and the authorizing official make decisions, but they can change that later if they want. But anyway, if you say yes, we're going to accept risk, or we recommend that you accept the risk, and you put that justification in there. If you say no, we don't recommend that this risk be accepted, then you're going to get a plan of action and milestone. You need to have a plan of action to get that risk remediated. Because if you're not going to accept it, and then you probably need to mitigate it. And so we have another template for your documentation pleasure.
So is it on the same document after we mitigate? So after we complete the mitigation step, is it on the same spreadsheet that we go and say mitigation completed? Or is it a different document that the authorizing official must see?
It's this. So now let me be clear. The in that SAR report, that's where you document everything. So sorry, let me go back because this is important, and this is, I always tell this story because. So if we have from our SAP template, our security assessment plan, and we have in our findings, we had 37 other than satisfied findings in there, let's say, 37. So in 37 of these rows, we had other than satisfied. When we come to our assessment report, we better see 37 things listed here. We better see 37 rows here. And after we were able to hire all those other staff members to help us do assessments, then I basically stopped doing assessments myself for the most part, and I started being the quality control officer. And so all of our staff would submit their findings to me, and before we gave them to the authorizing official, then I would check them for errors and reasonableness and whatnot. And guess what happened? Almost never did I find those two matching. If there was 37 findings of other than satisfied in the SAP, I almost never found 37 rows in my SAR. You know, I couldn't understand, and I still can't understand how that is possible. So, but apparently it is. So watch out for that if you're the assessor, or even if you're the system security officer or the system owner. You know, you watch out for that too, because you don't want things slipping through the cracks because your security assessor wasn't as thorough as he or she may have been. But in any case, so say you have those 37 findings that are here in your SAR, Security Assessment Report, and say you're going to mitigate 21 of them. So you're going to accept 16 and you're going to mitigate 21. And so we come to our plan of action and milestones. And then this is where we would then see how many, 21, weaknesses listed here and some sort of a plan of action to mitigate this. So by action is being taken because we're going to mitigate it. And so that's how you can kind of remember that what you're going to mitigate goes in the plan of action and milestones. But you still capture all 37 and still keep track of those in your SAR. And so all 37 never go away. The 16 that you accepted are still captured in that SAR. And then what do? We monitor those over time. We make sure that we didn't lose track of those and that nothing has changed there. But in any case, you put the weakness in this column. Who's responsible for fixing it? That's important. How much is it going to cost? If it's going to cost a lot and we don't have funding, maybe our scheduled completion date is 2 years out because we have to wait for funds to become available. Maybe it's something small. Maybe it's a process that needs to be written or developed and we can just have our internal staff do that. So we note whether or not resources are needed, what's our scheduled completion date. Maybe there's multiple steps that need to happen so we can divide it up into milestones and we can have interim completion date. Sometimes that helps keep us on track. Changes, if we find things aren't working, if we had some dependencies, we depend on some other organization and they didn't do what they needed to do and so now our milestones have slid. Our completion date, we can note that in there. How did we find the weakness? Was it in our assessment that we just did? Was it from a vulnerability audit that the Air National Guard did? Was it from some external audit? We want to capture all of those things that we're going to mitigate in here regardless of where we had the finding. And then finally we can keep track of whether or not we're finished by marking it complete or if we're not finished by marking it ongoing. So then really quickly, I know we're really close to noon here.
I'm sorry, one question about that. What if not all the mitigation steps we were able to complete? What if we could not fix that risk?
You wanted to fix it, but you can't because of whatever.
Yeah.
Well, then you just have to document that.
So do you put complete or do you put ongoing?
I wouldn't put complete, no. You might need to move it off into the accepted if it's something that you're going to have to permanently not
If you
do.
do that, then you put complete on
Yeah.
that one?
I would leave it as ongoing and put in the changes to milestone columns that it had to get. I don't know. That's kind of a squishy problem. So I mean, I guess you could remove it off of there because you're still going to have it captured in your SAR. So as long as you don't lose track of it. But anyway, let's try to wrap it up here. So once we have done all of those things that we've gone over in class today, we can move on to step 5, to the authorized step. This is where our authorizing official accepts or rejects the operation of the system. And we provide the authorizing official with these 3 documents: the security plan, the security assessment report, not the security assessment plan, but that final report, and then the plan of action and milestones template filled out that we just looked at. And then the authorizing official makes a decision. And then finally, assuming the authorizing official accepts the risk and authorizes the system to operate, we flip our switch, we start operating, and hopefully we did our work back in step 2. We have our monitoring process ready to begin, and we start monitoring. And so keep these things in mind. We did that early on, and we need to have things in place before the system starts operating. And then, of course, we talked in the overview about ongoing authorization. If you have a mature organization that has all these processes down and your continuous monitoring strategy and program is robust and mature, then you can start using it for ongoing authorization. And, of course, don't forget, as part of step 6, system removal and decommissioning, having some processes for that. And I think that is all. So we went right to the wire here this morning. So thanks for your attention and for coming to the workshop, and I hope it was helpful.